You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin and Tony is with me, and we are here to cover everything from June 10th through the 16th. We have a bunch of news. There is a little bit, I should say, not a bunch of news, but there is more news than there was last week, so we have a little bit less topics of discussion to kind of go through, but we do have a number of different things to cover. News kind of has picked back up, that is, towards the end of last week, so we have some stuff to discuss. So first up, Netflix. Netflix has expanded into Nigeria with Mo Abadu's Ebony Life production company. They're going to be creating some original projects for Netflix. Then Netflix has also picked up the romantic comedy The Perfect Find. This is a Gabrielle Union movie. Now, interestingly enough, it just so happens that we're going to talk about this in a second with Amazon, but it does seem like companies out there are more willing to purchase content that has already been created rather than going the original route at this immediate point just because of the production holds. So if there's a movie out there or a TV series that, I'm not sure what TV series wouldn't already have a home, but a movie out there that hasn't had a home or is a lower budget film that's not necessarily going to warrant a theatrical run necessarily, this is a huge option. We've talked about this for the last couple of weeks. We're just going to keep hearing about it. Prime Video, the one that specifically was mentioned is that there is a project called Flack, which was originally meant for Pop TV here in the United States, but they pulled the series and now Amazon has picked it up. And now this is starring Anna Paquin. She is an actress who previously was the main character of an HBO series, and she's been in a ton of other things as well. But this is another project, of course, that is being picked up that is going to end up on a streaming service specifically because of the fact that there's just production holds and they got to find content somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking into this news piece in Flack, and it looked like a interesting show that I would check out. So I'm glad that's going to be on Amazon Prime because I don't watch Pop TV. It's like, okay, cool, it's going to be on Amazon. I'll check it out. But even more so, it's kind of a surprise turn of events where you're going to have Pop TV that does its own thing, and you already have this show that's already filmed and completed. But instead of at least airing that in the midst of coronavirus, like even if it's not doing well, it's like you need content during this coronavirus shortage, pandemic, but then that's causing a work shortage for the future for content. It's like, why not just release those shows as it is? But this is great for Amazon. I mean, it's once again in the theme of we're seeing a lot of companies buying like feature films, and so this is I think it's one of the first times we've seen already filmed television show for all the different episodes being bought by another company. So that was kind of interesting, and it seems that Amazon likes the content and they can distribute seasons 1 and 2 on their platform with the option for a third. But then also it's they get that they don't have to do any like post-production or anything like that. So overall, I think it's a great deal for the people, for the showrunners, for the actors and actresses in the show, and then the audience as a whole, as we get to experience the show and more Prime content. So overall, I'm happy with this.
All right, and then we have a number of new projects that have been announced, not necessarily series orders, but we'll get into that. First off, there's a manga series called Promised Neverland that is being adapted. There's a comedy series called Rodeo Queens, which is a mockumentary style series featuring Dakota Johnson. That's landed at Amazon. The film Unraveling Athena has landed on Prime Video for the countries of UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Netherlands. And then there is a cooking show that Amazon is working on with James May, best known as one of the 3 from the original Top Gear, and also the Amazon spin-off, The Grand Tour. That's being in the works as well. There's also an autism comedy drama based on the Spectrum, which is an Israeli series that has gotten a series order at Prime Video as well.
This is a really interesting project. I mean, you read the project description, and it's a group of people on the autism spectrum who share a house, and we watch. It's a comedy, but we watch them do their life, and I think that's pretty cool. And I think streaming offers creators the opportunity to tell different stories. They're not pressured by advertisers to make sure that they fill the certain demographic at a certain time point. Let's make sure we get all men or women of this whatever at the 8 p.m. time slot. Like you can tell bigger and better stories. I think that's why I like streaming, is because these creators have the freedom to do so. And this show would never, I say never, but I think it's highly unlikely that this show would ever see the light of day on like a normal television network, coming out, at 7 p.m. on Thursdays. That's NBC's comedy spot. It's like you would never have seen this. And so to see creators share stories on streaming is great. And telling more about the lives of those who are on the autism spectrum, I think is also great as well, because I think that there's a lot of misconceptions that people have. And it's sad that we don't see more of those people in different medias and in different mediums. And so I'm overall happy with this project. And it's one of the reasons why I like streaming, is because you could take more risks and you get to explore more themes and view more people. So I'm extremely happy that this comedy's coming out.
Yeah, it definitely feels like it's on line with some of the recent series. Netflix has a series called Atypical, which deals with autism as well. I've watched it. It's actually a really good series. They're going to be doing a 4th season, and that's the final, and then the series will wrap. There was a series on ABC that was called Speechless. That lasted 3. It was about a boy who had cerebral palsy and how his family had to cope with that lasted 3 seasons before it got canceled.
Yeah, there's like more. It seems like there's a bigger push for people that are just very different than us and telling their stories. Down syndrome, autism, Asperger's. There's some show with Colby Smulders in it that was on, I think, CBS or something. It's adapted from a comic book, and one of the main side characters is disabled. So anyway, it was really cool just to see how there's a bigger push in entertainment for a presentation of people. But I think streaming offers even more so than the normal traditional route, because you're able to tell more stories, and you're not limited by what advertisers want. You're limited by what people are watching.
Yeah, I agree. I think that ultimately streaming services are just the best avenue for something like this, because it's not reliant on huge audiences, but it can be good evergreen content that can bring people in on a normal basis. I've heard people talking about Atypical online months after a season releases, so it's not something that it's just only going to be watched when it first comes out too. So, and that's content that every streaming service is looking for, is content that people can enjoy, but doesn't actually cost a lot, because honestly, those shows are very easy to produce. They're not very difficult to produce, and there's no reason you can't make more content like that. All right, so outside of Amazon, jumping over to Hulu, there's a series called The Other Typist, which will be a limited series that is in development at Hulu. We have nothing for CBS All Access. Apple TV Plus. Now, this doesn't specifically have to do with Apple TV Plus, but this is obviously how it was posed, because the article was on a site that deals with Apple products and things like that. But there's a new customer satisfaction survey that has been put out. This has been specifically put out by the American Customer Satisfaction Index, and they have basically polled a bunch of people and said, how do you feel these different streaming services, how do you think they do? And the average back in 2019 was 76, but obviously we've had some new additions that have popped up, specifically with Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus. They've popped up. So right out the gate, Disney Plus is actually ranked at 80 out of 100, which is first place. That's great for them. Last year, nobody was that high at all. The highest last year was 79 with Netflix. Apple TV Plus is actually ranked number 12. Now, I don't want anybody to focus so much on the ranking, because that's what, of course, the article is focusing on. Because the one thing about this article, but one thing about this graph is that they're not only including streaming services, they're also including streaming hubs. So like Apple TV's app, which allows you to subscribe to a variety of different smaller apps like HBO or Showtime, that allows you to do that. Same thing, Hulu allows you to do that too. But also on here, we've got the Microsoft Store. We have Twitch, which is obviously a streaming service, but I wouldn't put it in the same category as some of these other ones. They have HBO, which is labeled as HBO, but would probably entail just the HBO Go, HBO Now apps, or both of them, but obviously not HBO Max because it wasn't out yet. But then they also have Vudu on there, which is literally a digital marketplace specifically to buy products. They have some free stuff, yes, that is ad supported, but for the most part, it's a digital storefront. So take the rankings with a grain of salt, because it's not really the important thing. The important thing, however, is the numbers. So Disney Plus is 80 out of 100. Netflix is 78 out of 100. Hulu is 77 out of 100. Prime Video is 76 out of 100. CBS All Access is 75. Apple TV Plus is 74. And then the only other service that's on here that's specifically a service is Sony Crackle at 68. So there's a lot. It's not huge. It's not a huge difference between the top and the bottom by any means. It's only 12 points. But it is worth noting that Disney Plus just started and already usurped Netflix by 1 single point from last year and 2 points this year.
First looked at this article and I was like, okay, it's going to be about Apple and how they are ranked, but I'm honestly gained a lot more about the streaming landscape in general, and I'm surprised that Disney Plus is number one and it beats out Netflix. In terms of just the rankings are a little bit holistic in terms of app experience and original content, and I don't know, I feel like Netflix is the gold standard. I mean, they are the king. Hulu has been around in terms of like the user experience of their stuff. They've been around just as long as Netflix, and they have a pretty well-defined user interface. But I've heard a lot of people complain about Disney Plus, and I was one of those as well at first, of like trying to find different things and resume watching and continue playback and stuff like that. So I was surprised that they were number one just because of how limited content they have and how new the service was. So that was, to me, the most surprising point, and it kind of shows just how far Apple TV Plus is from, you know, kind of the competitors that they are number 12. I mean, I love how the category all other platforms is ahead of them. So and that's all the ones that weren't big enough to be enumerated by the list, and the list probably has about 30 or something key players in the streaming space. So I mean, overall, it's just it's Apple's just in a bind, and I don't think that they're quote unquote failure category as our friends at Quibi, but they are behind the pack, and they need to do a lot of different things to get ahead of the curve. So it was a very informative ranking. It was good.
All right, so then moving right along. Jumping over to Disney Plus, there's a movie that was originally scheduled to come out in theaters called The One and Only Ivan that has now moved from theatrical release over to Disney Plus. This is yet another one, Artemis Fowl, which was meant to be in theaters as well. It was supposed to release in theaters, I believe, in early May, but then it was moved to Disney Plus and just released last Friday. It ended up getting abysmal reviews, and people who have read the books said that they did a horrible job in adapting it into a film. I don't think we're going to be seeing any more Artemis Fowl films, but it does make perfect sense as to why this ended up on Disney Plus rather than making an effort to get it out in theatrical, because it probably wouldn't have done so well. This One and Only Ivan, I'm not familiar with it. My understanding is that it has to do with an elephant and an ape at a circus, and that's basically all I know about it. But I will say, just because something ends up on Disney Plus doesn't necessarily, it's not that it can't be a good movie. It does mean, however, that the studio doesn't believe that it has a huge possibility of making a ton of money at the box office regardless. You know, it could just be because it's, you know, a lower budget film or a mid-range film where there's not a lot of opportunity for it to make a ton of money anyway. And it also saves them marketing money too by not having to have it in theaters as well.
Yeah, I heard Artemis Fowl just was not good. Disney doesn't seem like they're afraid to pull content from the theaters. You know, a lot of it's been, you know, on the back burner due to the coronavirus, and it, unlike some other players, they're really liking the idea of since they have their own streaming service, that they can port, you know, these different movies that are definitely lower budget. I don't think Mulan or Black Widow would be put on Disney Plus. I mean, that'd be just huge news for the service, and it seems like it would be a financial loss, but a PR gain. But for these other movies like Artemis Fowl, it seems that they're okay with moving stuff to the streaming service, and I'm a little bit surprised that they haven't gotten as much flack as from other players like Universal putting their stuff on a streaming service. I mean, they got slammed by the movie theater chains, and it just doesn't seem like Disney is getting that same type of pushback. And maybe just because it's just Artemis Fowl doesn't look like it's going to be profitable, but Trolls would look like it would have been profitable. They're not getting as much flack, and yet they're doing it they're doing it a good chunk. I think because we reported on it a lot.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference though is with Trolls, it was paid video on demand, where you basically, if you want to watch Trolls, you had to pay for it, which was then directly taking money away from the possibility of theaters making money. Moving a movie from theatrical to streaming's free. Obviously, if you have the service, you're going to be able to get it. You're not paying for that single film. So the theaters aren't necessarily losing any money by it being on a streaming service. Obviously, if the film could make money, yes, they're going to lose money. But ultimately, the theaters are going to be more concerned about the big budget movies, the movies that are going to bring in a lot more people. They're going to be more focused on those. Trolls, I think at the time it was a bad example of, Universal was looking for an opportunity to get films out and to still be making money. The film did end up making a bunch of money, and they didn't have to worry about the theaters. While there's obviously some fallout from that with AMC claiming that they're never going to have Universal films in their theaters again, which we'll wait and see. AMC's not doing so hot right now themselves. But the important thing is, I think the difference is, it's like, it would be like the good comparison is like Trolls, which was a film that probably might have brought in like 150 million in the box office by when it was all said and done, compared to it brought in like $100 million in the first 2 weeks. It was on video because people had to pay for it, and there was a lack of being able to go to the theater and see it. And then a month later, Scoob happened, which was Warner Brothers, and I didn't really see a whole lot of pushback from the theaters related to Scoob either, even though it was very similar in the sense of it was basically they took it from a theatrical release and they instead made it so that it was a paid video on demand situation where if you wanted to watch it or rent it, you had to pay money to see it, just like you would have if you go into a theater. Disney pulling their projects, they're just sticking them on their streaming service, and the only one that even comes close is Onward, but it did technically premiere in theaters before everything shut down, and then it just landed on the streaming service way, way early because of it. But it wasn't like the theaters were going to be able to put it back in theaters, hypothetically, as soon as everything reopened, if everything was able to actually reopen in April like they were originally saying. So I think the biggest difference is Disney's not getting individual money for these projects like Universal was, or like Warner Brothers did with Scoob. They're just basically looking at it as, let's just put it on the streaming service because it gives us some content. And I honestly think this is a huge move for Disney going forward for the future, because when you look at the content that they have lined up for the rest of the year, obviously the theaters are going to be limited on how many different projects they can actually take on, just because of the lack of, even the megaplexes that have like 14 to 20 theaters or something like that, the amount of seats they can sell per theater is going to be such a small number that they're going to have to dedicate probably more screens to individual movies that are bigger, that could potentially bring in more money. So these lower budget films or mid-tier budget films aren't going to be the ones that are going to be bringing in, aren't even going to be able to get space ultimately. But when you look at Disney's like roundup of what they've got announced for the rest of the year, you've got Hamilton, which is coming to Disney Plus. You've got a Disney Channel original film, Secret Society of the Second Born Royals. That's coming to Disney Plus. You've got the Mulan film, which was originally supposed to come out in March. You've got the one and only Ivan, which is going to Disney Plus. Soul, which is Pixar's film, which is supposed to come out in November. And then there's two other films on the docket for Walt Disney Pictures. That's not obviously including the Warner or the Marvel films or the Fox films or anything like that, but that's what Walt Disney Pictures has on their plate for the rest. Magic Camp and Howard are the other two, and they're both scheduled to land on Disney Plus as well. So really the only two films that Walt Disney Pictures is putting out in theaters is Mulan and Soul, and that's if stuff doesn't shift again. Plus you've got Black Widow, and then you've got, I think there's New Mutants got redated for August. So that's just a couple films. It really should. I mean, at this point, it doesn't seem like it has a future. I mean, even if it was successful, let's put it that way. Even if it was successful, with everything being under the same roof when it comes to Marvel, there's no way that something with the X-Men doesn't get readjusted so that it can work within the MCU in the future. So why in the world wouldn't they just say, let's just cut our losses. This isn't going to tie into anything. Even if it was wildly successful, there's already, doubt about whether or not there will be another Deadpool film, because that was super successful. Both of the films did really, really well. But now that they're under Disney, it's like, well, how do you do that? How do you do a Deadpool film while it's under Disney? Because obviously you could do a hard PG-13, but it'd be difficult. But anyway, that's off topic. But yeah. I
mean, I'm just curious about your thoughts about this. I'm thinking about, movie theater chains and sending movies directly to streaming. And do you think when, the economies of the world open back up and people are able to go back to movie theaters, even though it's going to be at reduced capacity, some said 60%, between the range of like 30 to 60% is going to be like the standard opening capacity for a lot of these theaters. And, movies usually last in theaters for a certain amount of weeks. Do you think that there's going to be like any type of like renegotiation between like the movie theater chains and then also these studios, especially ones with streaming services, to either extend like the in-theater runs of movies for the theaters to basically try to capture that same amount of people that would buy seats, if they had all of the rest of the 50% of the seats open and available to be sold? Like, do you think there's going to be any renegotiation to either extend it, or for these streaming providers, for these studios to just, since you cannot guarantee the possibility for 100% capacity, that we're going to actually renegotiate this deal and we're going to go to streaming even sooner? Like, do you think in either direction of those two directions, do you think this could be any renegotiation, or are people going to be like, hey, it's a one-time thing with the coronavirus, like let's just play ball and just move forward?
I think honestly it's just going to move forward situation. And I think that honestly there's not a lot that can happen one way or the other. When you look at the big films that are scheduled for late July, you're looking at something like Mulan and Tenet, which are the first two big films that are going to be in theaters after theaters potentially reopen in July. You're looking at a situation where those two films are going to be the litmus paper for rest of the films for the rest of the year, because while people will probably, I'm sure there will be people who turn out to the theater, theaters are still going to be limited on how many people they can actually put in the theater. If you have to have 3 or 4 seats in between every single customer or every single group of customers, you've got a problem where theaters have huge overhead as it is. When you can't sell the tickets, the theaters, of course, could go the route of saying, well, can we ask for these films to be in theaters longer so that way we can try to recoup more money or make these movies more money? That's an option. But the issue with that is that at this point, there's pretty much a new blockbuster that's coming every 2 to 3 weeks, for the foreseeable future because of everything that's been adjusted. And then we get towards Christmas, and there's an insane amount of stuff that's, on the schedule for November and December. So the problem is, I don't know that they even have the opportunity to, extend the windows. I think that the studios, if anything, they might push for the digital release coming a little bit sooner, or the reality is people aren't coming to the theaters. We'll give you like a 6-week exclusive window, but because of the release schedule and the lack of people coming to the theaters, maybe after 6 weeks we can make it digital on demand. You can only rent it, like Universal was doing initially with a lot of the films that were in theaters when they first came out. Trolls, Invisible Woman, The Hunt, those films that came out initially, you had to rent them. You couldn't even purchase them at the time. If you wanted to watch it, you had to rent it. So it solved the problem of just being able to buy it and watch it whenever you want. But I honestly think that that's probably the only direction we could go, is a situation where the studios are like, let us put our films up for rent early. The biggest studio, obviously, who I could see that happening with is Universal, because they've already done it once. Warner Brothers did it one time with Scoob, but it's a matter of whether or not these theaters can even dedicate the theater space. Because like I said, I honestly think that a lot of these films that are coming out are going to have a higher theater count than ones in the past, because they're going to dedicate more theaters just so that more people can come and comfortably be able to go watch the film without the risk of having to jam pack into a theater. I mean, we'll see. I mean, it really is just going to come down to what happens at the end of July, because Tenet, I think, is scheduled for the last Friday of July, and the week prior to that, you've got Mulan, which is still on the books. A lot of stuff in August has already shifted around. Wonder Woman moved from August over to October. It'll be interesting to see, but I honestly think that the direction it could go is just the renting on digital after a certain number of weeks, because it just isn't viable to keep a film in theaters for potentially 3 months like it used to be.
Yeah, it's just there's so many different ways where this could go, and it's going to be a mess for mainly movie theaters and those chains. I think the studios will be fine either just going right digitally in terms of like renting first and then put it somewhere on a service for the long term, or just drop it directly on the service. But there's just so many different concerns in terms of seating and capacity in theater windows and contracts that this could potentially blow up a little bit, especially when it comes around with Tenet and Mulan, which those are like, two really, really big ones. Those are definitely going to be the litmus test, because there's a lot of good press about both of them. This is just going to be a tough time for the movie theater business, and you're just curious how it's all going to work out. But it's as we're starting to see reopening happening across the world in different contexts, and for especially the United States, different states are moving at different speeds. It's that this is going to soon to become a different and a potentially bigger issue, especially as AMC is still struggling with the flirting with bankruptcy and dealing with all their assets and whatnot.
I agree. All right, so moving right along, we've got Quibi. Chromecast is now available on Quibi. It only took 2 months, but Chromecast is now available if you're still using Quibi, which by the looks of it is not very many people because their numbers have continually spiraled. And then there was a nice little article that popped up on the Wall Street Journal that basically said that there has been some problems within Quibi amongst Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman, which wouldn't be a surprise because we've talked about this before. Just in those immediate interviews after the launch of the service, they were having contradictions between the two of them where Katzenberg was blaming the pandemic. She was saying that they had some problems, they acknowledged that there was problems and they needed to fix them. She seemed more looking towards the future, and he looked at trying to point the blame at something from the past or from something from the present. The Wall Street Journal article obviously is behind a paywall because it is the Wall Street Journal. There's a couple websites, including the one we've included in the show notes, specifically Vanity Fair, that have done kind of like a brief rundown of what is in the article. But basically, there were some problems between Katzenberg and Whitman dating all the way back to 2018 when Katzenberg brought in Whitman as the CEO of the company because there was already a clash of cultures between the two of them and how to run things and how to get things done. So it just does not bode well for Quibi. It seems like every week or every other week we have another thing to talk about when it comes to Quibi and how they're not doing so great, and this is just another one. So instead of celebrating the fact that they have Chromecast, because I don't use Quibi anymore and don't care, instead we're talking about how they had problems back in 2018 before they even got off the ground.
Yeah, where could we go and talk about this? I mean, it's just so many different ways, and it's the idea of Quibi, once again, I think was bold, and I think it was good to at least push the big players and push the media space in terms of high-end content that's for mobile, preferably mobile only, and it's going to be just in short clips. I think that was a interesting business idea, and it needed to come about. I think that's the beauty of, America, that we can create a business just like this. However, it's like you could make a documentary about the rise and fall of Quibi, and it would be pretty entertaining, honestly. It can make it to its own movie just because of just the drama that's happening and how they just got Apple Play support, they just got Chromecast support, they fixed their major issues from the hiccups from their launch, and yet we're talking about an article about how it seemed like it was a marriage that was supposed to fail to begin with. So it's just, for Quibi, they just can't seem to get out of their own way, and it's every time they take a step forward or two steps forward, they just get hit smacked in the face. So honestly, it's sad, and then it worries me. There were some concerns about the money situation. We talked multiple times that they've raised a good amount of money, around $1.75 to $2 billion between a couple of different rounds of funding, and it's content's expensive, and they've definitely greenlit a lot of content and shows. Setting up a mobile platform, getting all the servers to work, all that stuff's expensive, and they've racked up a lot of costs, and there's now concerns that they're gonna have to raise even more money given, what's a polite way to say, kind of failing state, I guess, as many people think that Quibi's failing, and it's they need to raise more money for the future. So it just shows how much cash you need to do a streaming service and how hard it is. And we have the great centerpieces of the great launches is Disney Plus, and how they're on the track to rival Disney in a few years. Rival Netflix in a few years in terms of top supremacy, but they're the golden child of launches. No major issues, they fixed them all, they have cash, it's great. Then you have Quibi, which is the quintessential failure of launching a streaming service and stuff like that. So I'm curious how, if these rumors are of them getting more rounds of funding, I'm curious how that's going to go. I think investors and advertisers are extremely upset with them. So that's just going to be just a big ball of fun, and we get to report on it. So it's once again our Quibi session, where it's a funny name, and it should make you smile because it's so weird, but it is sad to see something fail so dramatically in the public eye.
All right, so then jumping over to HBO Max, we have a couple of different things. First up, I want to specifically talk about an article that popped up on June 11th over at Sensor Tower that specifically talks about the downloads for HBO Max over the first 2 weeks. Now, we talked about something last week when we were talking about the reviews. There was a report that came out that said that HBO Max was only had 80,000 downloads in the first day that it launched, which put it way behind even Quibi. And at the time, we were like, well, something doesn't seem right about that. And then it ended up coming out that it was in fact off because anybody who had already had HBO Now, it immediately pushed an update that transformed, I should say, HBO Now into HBO Max. So you didn't have to go download a new app. However, this new information from Sensor Tower puts a different perspective into light and contradicts the information that was actually put out that said that they only had 80,000. The Sensor Tower didn't put out the information, but that information that came out that said that they only had 80,000 downloads in the first day is very incorrect. So when you look at April, for the HBO apps in general, they were averaging about 900,000 for the entire month of downloads. In May, obviously with the HBO Max launching at the very end of May, you have 1.6 million downloads for HBO Max in the course of obviously just a few days, including the other HBO apps. But specifically, when you dive into the numbers even a little bit further, it showcases that HBO Max that they've attracted approximately 1.7 million downloads on the US App Store and Google Play in the first 2 weeks of availability. HBO Max replaced the company's previous app, HBO Now, and has already surpassed the app's previous best day of installs. On May 28th, the day after its launch, HBO Max hit approximately 337,000 installs by first-time mobile users. This is nearly double HBO Now's peak number of 172, which occurred back in April 15th, 2019, the day after the final season premiere of Game of Thrones aired. Since its launch, HBO Max is installed by an average of approximately 121,000 first-time US users per day. That is 572% more than HBO Now's daily average of about 18,000 installs in the 14 days leading up to HBO Max. To put in perspective, there's a thing in here specifically talking about where they're sitting at in comparison to their competitors. The competitors that are out there, obviously, like I said, that initial number of 80,000 downloads put in perspective, oh my gosh, they're way behind even where Quibi was at. That's horrible. And everybody, and I mean everybody, every analyst went on and on about how big of a deal that number was, how low it was. And the problem is it just wasn't the full picture. It wasn't the full picture at all. This actually points out that HBO Max is on the exact same trajectory as Disney Plus was within its second week, because Disney Plus saw an average daily install about 29% from its initial launch week, while HBO Max is sitting at 30% of its first week launches. So it's actually growing at a slightly faster rate than Disney Plus did after its initial launch. Now, that's not to say that Disney Plus didn't have millions more subscribers. It did have millions more subscribers. It, reached 10 million subscribers. But the path of growth is actually greater for HBO Max than Disney Plus. Now, of course, that's just comparing Disney Plus. When you start comparing it to other ones, at the rate that they're growing, we're talking the end of July, they're probably going to surpass the all-time numbers of Quibi. The fact that there was analysts that were using Quibi as a baseline comparison, I think is not something that should have ever happened.
I agree, and I remember we were talking about this and how I brought that up as well, is that HBO Max's numbers are not... they're not properly calculated because a lot of people's HBO Now apps, whatever, automatically converted to HBO Max, and so you're losing out on a lot of people because they're not already downloading this. Like it's that their apps are already being rolled over into this new project, and so those numbers were not being captured. I still think that these numbers are a little bit misleading in terms of it's great that we're seeing growth in HBO Now, but it's only comparison to its older service, and it's not really. I think that's kind of a little bit unfair comparison because HBO Now was playing the content of HBO, of what you think canonically of HBO for a specific audience. I mean, I think HBO has a lot of subscribers, so it's people know about HBO, but it's still kind of a niche audience where HBO Max is offering itself to be for the whole entire family. Like I grew up and we did not have HBO because it did not fit in with the certain values that my parents had. But HBO Max, I mean, that's something that they might consider now just because, yeah, you get HBO, but they don't really care about that. But there's a whole lot of other content out there that one is able to watch. So although I'm happy about the numbers, I'm curious how it still is against its competitors of Disney, of Netflix, of Apple, just for the future. future, just because like I feel like the numbers that we saw today are good indicators of, okay, it's not failing. It's obviously, it seems like there are more people who are more interested in HBO Max than there were of the old HBO service. But how is HBO Max being compared with the whole streaming marketplace as a whole? And those are just numbers we don't have yet. So I'm glad that there's always more data and more context given to the data, but it's still a little bit too soon to tell about how HBO Max is given all the other players in the market. I mean, we won't know those numbers until probably the next quarterly earnings report that happens.
All right, and then some other HBO news. HBO has announced, or I shouldn't say HBO, but Warner Media has announced they're getting rid of HBO Go and HBO Now as they currently sit. So the best way to explain how this is all happening is I've seen a bunch of different articles, and it makes it seem like it's much more confusing, when in reality, it actually is simplifying it once you look past how the transition will actually work. If you currently have HBO Now, you've already, like we just talked about, you have basically upgraded to HBO Max. You don't have to do anything. Your existing service will just switch over to HBO Max. So anybody who was an HBO Now subscriber outside of most of the places where you're just subscribing to the single channel, you now have HBO Max. So you've already been converted over an HBO Max customer. HBO Go is disappearing. That is going away. So HBO Go, for those who don't know, HBO Go was the service that if you had a cable provider, this allows you to log in with your cable provider information and you'd be able to access it on the go. It's basically like an on-demand option when you're on the go to access HBO through your existing cable subscriber or your service that you're subscribing through. So that was what HBO Go was. They're getting rid of HBO Go. By the end of July, it should be phased out, but then they said a couple weeks after it still might be working online, but it eventually will be completely gone. Now, what will then happen is HBO Now, and this is where it gets confusing, but honestly, if you just look at it as it's a new thing, it doesn't really make a difference. You have HBO Max, which will exist as is. HBO Go will disappear. HBO Now, anybody who's left using HBO Now, it will be renamed just HBO, just straight HBO. And then going forward, there's only going to basically be two options. You have the HBO channel that you subscribe to through your cable provider, or it's a channel option through the different providers like Amazon or Roku and things like that. You can still watch all the HBO content, still subscribe to HBO for the exact same price. The app that will also allow you access, depending on which one it is, will be called HBO only. There will be nothing else attached to it, it'll just be called HBO. And the idea behind that is it'll basically simplify it to, we have two services. We have HBO, which you can watch through your cable provider, through the channel stores, and you can watch it on the go if you just want HBO, or you can have HBO Max for the exact same price. And that one, yes, you're not allowed to necessarily watch on every single service, but you can watch it through most providers. Most cable providers actually give you access to HBO Max with your existing subscription, so you can still access it, but that's basically how it works. So the idea is, it seems extremely complicated. I'm sure I'm not doing the best job of explaining it, but there will be two. There will be an HBO and there will be an HBO Max, and that's it. Go Now, those adjectives or additives when it comes to the apps will be gone, and you basically will be either an HBO subscriber through the very many avenues that you already can subscribe to HBO, or you'll be an HBO Max subscriber, which allows you to either be a subscriber or you're getting it from one of those existing provider deals that are in place. So the idea is they're simplifying it because obviously they know, and we all knew, and we've talked about this ourselves, that the confusion was there and was going to confuse a lot of people. And now that HBO Max is actually launched, they've said this is one of their focuses that they want to do. They do, in fact, want to simplify it. And honestly, after the simplification takes place at the end of July, HBO Max and HBO will be two separate things. Anybody new coming on board is going to know what the difference is. HBO Max has a larger library of content. HBO is just HBO. So I honestly think it is much simpler. I think the confusion is for people who are looking at it now and saying, you're going from 3, but you're going down to 2, but this one's turning into that, and this one's doing this, and this one's serving this purpose. So just don't look at it like that. Just look at it what will be after July 31st, and it's actually pretty simple.
Thank you for clearing that up, because I feel like Warner Media just has a bunch of these different services. You know, you have like 3, now 2 HBOs with HBO in the names. Just the point is that there's a lot of, Warner Media's got a lot of different streaming platforms, so I'm glad that they're at least trying to consolidate it down by a little bit. It's also just important for brand awareness too, that HBO like itself is a brand. Then you got HBO Go, which is its own thing, HBO Max, which is its other thing. And then finally you get to now, it's like for brand identity purposes, it's just a little bit confusing to have all those different names. So I'm glad that with the launch of this new product, they're also trying to streamline their house a little bit and get things more organized.
So then the last thing for HBO is it was announced. Let me take it back. So if you're not from the United States, you're outside the United States, I'm sure you still have heard of it because this has been happening elsewhere. But there's the Black Lives Matter movement has picked up a lot of steam because of current events that have happened here in the United States. In conjunction with that happening, there has been some things that have popped up that correlate to the Black Lives Matter movement, but not necessarily specifically having to do with the police brutality or the unjustified deaths of people that have prompted the spark that has ignited the larger fire of the protests that have been happening, not just here in the United States, but around the world. That being said, one of the things that happened was director John Ridley, he posted an op-ed on the LA Times basically asking for Gone with the Wind, which is a film from the 1930s, to be removed, but temporarily. He did not specifically say it should be removed forever, but in observance of what's been happening in the world right now, and specifically here in the United States, he asked for it to be removed. He said that it should come back. It's not that it should go into a vault and disappear and nobody knows that it exists, because it is a work of art that does deserve to be seen. Warner Brothers, or Warner Media in general, they acknowledged that this needed to happen. They took the film off the service and said that it was just a temporary situation. They were going to put it back on, but instead they were going to make sure that when it came back onto the service, that it was going to have an intro with somebody from the African American community acknowledging that this is a work of art, but in expressing why it's important for this film to exist and to be seen. Because when you take something off a service and you just decide to pretend like it doesn't happen, you run into a situation where it becomes like a censorship situation where you pretend something like this never happened. And instead of acknowledging that it did happen, acknowledging that we have to change as a society, you just pretend like it doesn't happen. Now, I say this specifically because there's two different situations, and I'm not specifically talking about Gone with the Wind here, but Warner Brothers in the past has dealt with situations like this before. There has been times where they have released collected editions of Looney Tunes from, the 1940s when racism was huge when it came to Japanese Americans and things like that. And there was shorts that were created featuring Looney Tunes characters that showcased this racism against Japanese Americans. When they released the DVDs, instead of just deciding we're going to leave these off the DVDs, we're not going to put them out there, they acknowledged that they should not have existed, but they did exist. And they put disclaimers at the front of the shorts saying this is not how it is now, but it would do what happened in the world an injustice by not saying that this exists. So we're showing you this so that you understand what took place in the world. Gone with the Wind is the same situation, but when you compare it to a company like Disney, for example, that has a situation where if you are on Twitter and you follow any sort of Disney stuff whatsoever, you'll constantly hear about random things that pop up where weird things are being censored when it comes within the Disney app. You'll see a mermaid's butt from Splash being censored because it doesn't exist, even though the movie is rated PG. You'll see a disclaimer within the title screen of movies like Dumbo, which have racist elements, but it doesn't actually put anything attached to the film itself so that you're actually seeing. You have to actually know where the warning is. That's the case with Disney. But then there's other projects that Disney they've decided that they don't ever want out in the world, and one of the biggest examples of that is a movie called Song of the South, and there's characters within it that could be perceived and are perceived as racist elements, and instead of acknowledging that it was part of their company's history, they try to just say, well, we want it to stay in the vault and it's never going to come out. Gone with the Wind was much more successful than a movie like Song of the South, but it does show that the studio they're not looking towards a project like this and saying, we're going to censor it, we're going to take things out of it, we're going to pretend like it was all a better thing. And Tony and I were talking about this before, and I'm a white male, and I can't honestly sit here and say that I know how it is to have to deal with some of the stuff that we're hearing about when it comes to social media and things like that, and people speaking out to say what happens. But I will say that I watched the series Watchmen on HBO last year, and when that show started, started off, it showcased a sequence where they had these horrible race riots, which they call them race riots, but it was much worse. It was more like a massacre, as Tony put it before we were talking, before we started recording the episode. But they showcased this horrible event that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the early 1900s. And at the time, my wife, who's also white, and I were looking at each other and saying, did this actually happen? And when we looked into it, it turns out it wasn't entirely true, and was something that I pride myself in knowing a lot about American history. I had never ever heard about in my 30 plus years on this earth, and it was kind of disturbing that something like this had actually happened, but had been so quietly swept under the rug and nobody knows about it unless maybe you're from that specific area of the country. It's a horrible thing, and my point is censorship should not be the answer to horrible things happening. Instead, acknowledging that it was wrong and saying this was wrong and addressing it is a better solution. So everything that's happening with Gone with the Wind is looking like that is the direction it's going to happen. They're not going to edit the film. They're not going to take parts out of it. They're going to instead showcase why this movie does what it does and why that was the viewpoints when the film was made. So I think it's props to Warner Media for doing this. It's important to not censor our country's history, the entertainment history, the industry's history. It shouldn't be something that is censored to just show the good things.
Yeah, I'm a little bit torn just because I know that in terms of the importance of Gone with the Wind in cinema, I mean, it's people for film school, I mean, they go to watch this movie. It's the first movie ever in Hollywood that had a curse word in it. I mean, its legacy on film and media is huge in terms of just it being just such a huge feature film. It really pushed things forward. However, that doesn't excuse its portrayals of African Americans, and it doesn't excuse slavery. It doesn't excuse the injustices done on African Americans. It doesn't excuse that, and it shouldn't, and we shouldn't forget that. So it's hard to sit here and being like I'm for censorship or no censorship. It's because I understand both point of views. I understand where these two arguments are. I personally live in southern United States, and there's a big push to remove Confederate statues of Confederate generals, or moving their names or likeness from different things. I mean, I went across the street from my elementary school was the Jefferson Davis, high school, and when you're a kid, like, you go on a field trip to the presidency of the Confederacy. You go to that place in Alabama. And I mean, it's a cool trip just because you get out of school. But, in a few years after that moment, you realize how awful that is. I mean, it's one great to view and be a part of history and to see it. But when you understand it, it's just different. So it's coming from that context of where I live, and I understand why people don't want to take down Confederate generals or their likenesses, because you don't want to forget history. But at the same time, that is hurtful to a large group of people. And unlike before, if you wanted to watch a movie or a film, you'd have to go to the Blockbuster, to the movie stop, or wherever you'd get movies, and you would just check it out. But now we have this content in our hands, at our fingertips, on our TVs, instantly at any time. I feel like there are going to be bigger pushes for studios to help regulate that content. It's different adding parental control so that kids can't watch like Game of Thrones or something. That type of censorship is fine, but it's in terms of like culture and movies, that's hard, because I understand both points, but I don't condone violence or injustice against people. And I don't appreciate how my schools did not teach me about the Tulsa race massacre. I love how some articles say it's the Tulsa race riot, and there's like protests, then there's riots that are like one step further in escalation. But when you basically wipe out a whole town or a large district of the town, that's a massacre. And so it's when I learned that through an interview about the Watchmen TV show, I was just frustrated. And I think it's important not to forget where we were. It's important to not forget our past. It's important to not forget how awful people can be, but it's also important to not celebrate that. It's important to not encourage that in any way. And so I think that these streaming studios as a whole, if we're looking at Gone with the Wind as a greater, through the larger scope of things, I think streaming services are going to have a hard time, because what are they going to do? It's going to be interesting and tough. And I think the smart route is to just, release it as is, and have some type of disclaimer, either just through a piece of text, or like maybe an interview, or like a panel of people, of experts in the area, of why certain things aren't right, why certain things aren't appropriate, why this shouldn't be celebrated. Like, this movie has awful portrayals of African Americans, either because they're slaves, or just the attitudes and actions of the white people against them. And it's like, you should talk about that. I mean, like, and then it's just an interesting topic. And what are you gonna do about like Django Unchained? That's, a Quentin Tarantino movie where it's set in like slavery times, and the character Django just kills everyone. Like, where you get in the question of these streaming services, where's the line going to be drawn? And I think at some point, like, the buck's going to be passed to us as the viewers of like, okay, like, we have the information, the Warner Brothers or other streaming providers have given us the information that this is not culturally relevant. It's not accurate at all. We don't glorify this. This shouldn't be glorified. We should watch it to remember the past and the history, and to move forward, to press further for bigger and better things. That's what it should be about. When I watched Selma, that's with the rise of a lot of these protests, a lot of streaming services have offered different movies as free for the rest of the month. And I watched Selma. It's portrayals of what African Americans went through. It's hard to watch, because you're just like, I can't believe this happened not that long ago. Obviously, or no one in sound mind is going to sit there and like root for the lynchings and whatnot. But you watch it and you remember, and I'm just moved, because of, it's like, there's so much more that needs to happen. Look at where we were, but there's still so much more that can happen. And that's what I see when watching that movie. And it'd be a shame for like that type of content not to come out, because it pressures you to move forward, to move past where we are. But that's a little bit different situation with Gone with the Wind. But to really wrap up my point, it's a hard conversation for these streaming services to have, especially as we're getting content more in our hands. And I think that the best that they can do is, there's some things that may not be appropriate. They're so offensive and so hurtful that there is no conceivable almost excuse for it to be out there. And it might be appropriate for some of that content to be taken away, because it could be used as propaganda by different hate groups or different militias that are just have angry intents. But for stuff with Gone with the Wind, it's important just to remember where we are, where we've come from, and to move forward, and to have disclaimers of this is behavior, these are actions of the time period, and they're not to be celebrated. It's not meant to be happy. It's meant to just be what it is and to tell the story. And that's kind of a little bit of a rambling point. It's just, it's hard. It's hard to talk about what is right for these platforms and publishers to do. I mean, it's hard. Because it's, especially in America, you have this idea of, well, we can show whatever we want, free speech. And it's like, well, I mean, you have that debate. You have this idea of what's best for families, what's best for communities and culture and business. It's just, it's a complex issue. And I think Gone with the Wind is going to be the beginning of a long series of movies that these movie studios have in their backlog, that they're going to have to make some tough decisions on of what are we as a company going to be? What as a company are we going to do? And it's going to be tough.
It is definitely going to be an interesting future, and the biggest thing is we can just hope for change and hope for the best, but we do have to hold things accountable when they're not the best version of what they can be. So, all right, so with that, we have one last thing, just a real quick thing for Peacock. It was announced that some of the Premier League games, once the season resumes, will end up on Peacock as well. This is also, obviously, we've already heard there's some Premier games that are going to be on Amazon Prime for free. Peacock will have some of those available as well. So that is all the news for this week. We do have a couple of trailers that have released, a little bit more trailers, I should say a lot more trailers than last week, because we only had one single one last week, and now it's back to our normal standard group of trailers. So definitely check out the trailers that have released. There's some new trailers for a bunch of the new HBO Max originals that are coming. There's obviously a ton of stuff for Netflix, so definitely check those out. Outside of that, you can follow us on Twitter and join our Discord for all these articles that we talk about here on the podcast and some that we don't. You can follow us on Instagram for all the latest announcements related to new episodes of the podcast posting. You can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, topics you'd like us to cover on future episodes. Those are always greatly appreciated as well. Our website is thestreamingwars.io, where you can find all of our episodes, as well as you can find all the episodes on all podcast platforms that you typically listen to a podcast on, as well as YouTube. We have the show available over there as well. So with all that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.